Welcome to the ITSPmagazine podcast network. You're listening to a new episode of the CIBEAT podcast, where your host, award-winning author and cybercrime journalist, Deb Radcliff, interviews hackers, coders, intelligence experts, agents, officers, cybersecurity pros, and other interesting harbingers, heroes, and warriors. These conversations are sure to get you thinking. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Hello, I'm Deb Radcliff, host of CIBEAT, part of ITSPmagazine, at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. With us today is Renee Guttman, an early days CISO back when there were none, who's worked with in the CIS roles at big brands including AOL Time Warner, Coca-Cola, and Caribbean Cruise Lines. Today, she's offering her services as a consulting CISO and also advising VCs on cybersecurity investments. Welcome, Renee.
Hey there, glad to be here. Nice to see you and everybody else who's listening.
You and I go way back in the industry, but you've worked in it longer than I have. Can you tell us how far back you go and how you, quite literally in my mind, shaped the role of the CISO?
Yeah, glad to. Now, I want to share a little bit of a personal story. I fell into security because I was doing email administration and my company went through a merger and I frankly lost my position. So I walked across a hallway, and I opened the door to the security team and I said, "You got any jobs here?" And they said, "Yep, come on in." And I've never looked back. And that was 30 years ago. And I will tell you that back in the day, we called it data security. I don't think we even thought of it as IT security. I don't remember what we called it, but we weren't really thinking big picture then. So that was at Glaxo Wellcome. I was one of the very first analysts at Gartner in 1998. I'll give the year. And actually the first CISO was Steve Katz, and that was 94. So just about the time that the role was becoming, a C-level role. I then went on to build the infrastructure for Capital One, to put their financials on the internet. Who can recall the day that you weren't even able to get to your financials? Then I went on to Time Inc. and Time Warner. And then to your point, Royal Caribbean, where I was doing maritime cybersecurity, which is quite fascinating. And then Campbell Soup, most recently, where I was really working on their manufacturing. And I will tell you that when I was thinking about this, Deb, I remember sitting around at NIST in 94 or something like that with a couple of people wondering about whether, something like a NIST standard would, A, whether security would ever matter, and B, whether something like a NIST standard would ever come about. So I feel very fortunate to have been in the early days and help, build this industry.
Excellent. When you were talking to me once about maritime security, you brought up a couple of interesting points that a cruise line may not have thought of back then for areas of risk. I recall you talking about the onboard internet of a ship once. Could you explain some of the risks there?
Well, yes. So there are things that the passengers see. The entertainment, the cards, that you use to get in everywhere. And then there's things that really, basically make the ship sail. And those things include the satellite systems, the propulsion. We even had a robotic bartender on one of our ships. And the people that built it were in Italy. When they had to do maintenance, they would log in to this robotic bar, from Italy. So not only is it, sailing out there, but it's still connected, and satellite is a big deal. And then here's the challenge as a CISO or as a security practitioner in that environment. When you have to patch, you're literally consuming bandwidth from that satellite. And there's a real tension, right, between how good the satellite is, for the paying passengers versus how much do you really need to be able to push a patch, over those same wires. So it just makes you think a little bit differently about disconnected. And frankly, there's a lot of on-prem systems on a ship. We tend to think of the cloud now, but ships still have a lot of on-premise systems.
Interesting. So, given all your experience at all these blockbuster companies that you've worked at, and now you're doing VCISO work, which is a virtual CISO, you're doing advising to investment firms. Can you sort of explain to us what your focus areas are now and what is important to you as a person with all of this experience and knowledge to share with the industry?
So I was really lucky over the course of my career in terms of building and working for big companies. And so I think I had a perspective that you could just have a security program and you could hire people and you could just get things done. And so now that I've left these big companies and I'm working more with companies that are smaller and nonprofits even, for that matter, you realize that we really have a lot of people that aren't staffed, that don't have the funding that I enjoyed at some of these bigger companies. So my passion now, I have a couple, but one of them is I did start a little company and I consult under that company to some other companies. So, but those companies have to be invested in helping community type of, the smaller tech companies, community colleges and things of that nature. So they at least have to be able to consult to the smaller companies for me to want to work with them. Number two, I am working with venture capitalists and I am working with some early startups. And I am really excited about the level of innovation that I'm seeing these days. You'd think that we just couldn't possibly need another security product. And I would tell you that's not true. In fact, what we need now, I think, is a lot more automation and innovation. And so I'm really excited about the work that I'm doing with the companies that I'm working with.
Well, as a disruptive analyst looking for new ways to do security, I will be following this part of your career very closely. One of the areas you're focusing on is what you're calling the security poverty line. By that, you mean small businesses and medium businesses aren't getting the benefit of security tools and talent that the blockbuster companies do, such as those you've worked for in the past. Can you explain that better than I just did?
I'm going to try because you did a nice job,
Thank
but it is a term of art and people can look it up,
Mhm.
the security poverty line. And it's either been around, 12 years or 10 years, but it is attributable to a lady by the name of Wendy Nather, who spoke about the security have and have nots. And again, this was about 10 years ago. And really, it was based around the idea that, security can only be funded to the level that the company had money, to be able to fund the program. And so it creates, again, this situation where you have the big companies, the financial institutions who can really afford and build the big teams, and get ahead, at least try to get ahead of security risk. But then you have the smaller companies that may not even have anybody, firstly, probably not with a CISO title. They might have a director of network or something that might have security as their side job. And they just don't have the same ability, I think, to be able to even put in, and this is the key part, some of what's called essential cybersecurity. So if you think about things like multi-factor, or if you think about endpoint monitoring, they may not even be able to afford to do that, or they may not be able to maintain it, or they may not be able to, implement it correctly. So it's a problem, and that's where I spend a lot of time when I think about the consulting work and who I want to consult with, looking at how we can help those organizations, because it's municipal governments. I mean, if you think about it, if a municipal government is attacked, I mean, is your 911 going to work? So that's a big problem, and there's a lot being written about that now. So it's something that people are really starting to think about. And I've spoken about it a number of times. Other people are speaking and writing about it. It was actually the topic at RSA this year. And I don't know if they called it a humanitarian crisis, but it's a problem.
It is. It's been a problem my entire career as a journalist covering this space. Everything's relative, though. SMBs may not need the same types of protection as the larger counterparts, but they need more than they have in place now. What do you see as the biggest inhibitors to these sizes of organizations actually getting the security and compliance posture that they require?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. Number one is awareness, and I think that some people aren't aware. So, for example, if you're in a community college, there's a very good chance that you have cameras and you have other interconnected systems, right? So partially it's thinking about not just your compute that you can see, like your PCs, but everything else that's connected. And I think once you do that, you start to think, okay, maybe I might have a problem here. So the first, I think, is becoming more aware of what the risks are. Number two, I think they don't have access to the same advice. And what I mean by that is that the companies that I'm consulting with right now, and including the folks that are acting virtual CISOs, are the ones that most likely are consulting to these smaller organizations. They just can't afford the $500 an hour, and they likely won't pay for $500 an hour type of consultants. But at the same time, there probably aren't enough consultants to go around, and there may not even be enough people with expertise, to really get out there and to consult to these organizations. So I think a second problem is just access to people that can help them. And then the third, I think, is just, once they know, and they just have to start being more accountable. I think that's, something that I would like to see. Unfortunately, how do I say it? I'm not a big heavy-handed person, but I do think that this could require some level of oversight from our governments, especially in critical infrastructure and environments that can really impact the safety of the communities. And I think that there should be a little bit more oversight. Like I said, municipalities fall into this boat, and I would hate to see our 911 or our water, things that we rely on go out because they're not being taken care of properly.
That makes good sense. Is this everybody's problem? For example, if I'm a large business, I have a bunch of SMBs supporting my business. Is this an issue where that large businesses should also be assisting some of their business partners? Would that be an impact area that can be tended to? Or where do you see the impact of this falling in the overall structure of who has security and who doesn't?
So I do think because of what I said, it is everybody's problem. I mean, when you think about municipal governments, I mean, companies rely on police services just the way, local citizens do.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that I think has become a problem is what I call supply chain disruption. And if you think about the way, example, manufacturing, everybody went to just in time, right? So here you are happily manufacturing something. But what if your container company, got ransomware and they can't deliver you containers? What are you going to do with the product that you just produced? I mean, you don't have a container.
Yeah.
And so, and those are the companies that big companies, rely on, to basically help them to deliver their product and services. And so I do think it's everybody's problem. The problem, though, is that I don't think big companies are necessarily best able to then support their smaller companies. In fact, I have a bit of a beef here because I do think, third-party reviews, which a lot of companies do, in fact, penalize the small companies. And you basically say, well, you don't have a good program here, and we don't want you to be a vendor. At the same time, if that small company turns around and says, hey, can you help me? Can your team help me? The answer is probably no, I'm understaffed anyway. And then you say, well, let me introduce you to somebody. And that goes back to the problem that I talked about earlier. I've just recently become aware of much more services that are out there for smaller companies to leverage, which frankly now I know about, but back in the day I didn't know who to refer people to.
Wow. Okay. You know, this problem's been around so long, it seems like it would be solvable, but, I watched Symantec start with the small companies and then scale up to be a client company that serve big companies. I've watched other vendors that start with big companies try to scale down to support smaller businesses. But I've never really seen this issue resolved in the whole 30 years I've been reporting on cybersecurity in a satisfactory way that could be replicated. I,
You know, so I want to end, I want to leave you at least with a positive thought, and that
but
is I didn't realize how much is being done. And so I actually am much more positive and excited about what I see happening. And I see goodness. And when I think about how I see goodness now, let me give you some examples of the goodness that I'm seeing. Firstly, there's a lot of podcasts. So if you need to learn, you don't necessarily need to spend 3,000 on a conference. You can, you can really your teams can learn. Secondly, there is a lot of freemium products out there now, and I didn't realize how many there are, but there are more coming. And so the cost, I think, it can be more manageable, if you know where to look. And then secondly, I do see a lot more people in the VC. So I see a lot more companies that have really made it their mission, and I'm not going to name them, but they are missioned around. I don't know that that's a word, but they have a purpose and a company culture of serving, the small, medium businesses. Financial institutions, have sessions and services for their private clients as well. So I think there's a lot more being done. The government's doing some good things, through publishing some of the papers that they have. And then where I get really excited is that I think innovation is stepping up, and where we need to really support it is we need to really start to embrace things like AI and machine learning and things that will really cut down on the mundane, residual, people sucking tasks that, that especially those that take place in the middle of the night, those. And so I think there's a lot of things that will actually help to make a difference across our communities.
Excellent. And technology is good at replacing repeatable tasks and things like that. So I see your point. Um, so you actually already asked my last question about pushing this poverty line so that SMBs can establish basic security and compliance controls for their needs. Do you have any resources that you've researched lately that we could direct them to in this podcast?
Well, there is a CISA document. I don't know if I would name it as a resource. I think it's a place to start. Are there resources, without naming specific companies? Here's what I think. Let me give you a different thought. And I'm seeing this, and again, I'm seeing, and I don't think there's a specific resource, but I think there's a real push for what I'm going to call the basics. So that's, and I know they're being built, so they're not there yet, but people are talking about what is the pattern? What is that minimum that should be out there? And it's things like endpoint, it's things like basic awareness training, it's making sure that you have an incident response plan. MFA, I already talked about that. I have a short list, but I've seen a list, and it's probably no more than 10 or 12. And the other thing, and I was looking at it just a little while ago, security as a service. So I'm starting to see that being offered by different organizations. And again, I don't want to name anybody, but I think that if you were in a position, of being a small or medium business, I think, and people can write to me, Deb. So let's make sure that we know how to find me on LinkedIn, and then I can get a little bit more specific. But there are companies that are offering these types of services more as a bundle, as a package. It doesn't mean you have to, buy every product, or they tell you exactly what to buy, but they can offer you what I'm going to call the essentials. And I think if you can get the essentials right, that's a good way to lift yourself out, of that bullseye zone, right? Where you just are probably the lowest common denominator out there, that's what gets me excited. So again, I would say I'm starting to see it. I'm starting to see people talk about the essentials. I'm seeing those packages being built and offered. And let's hope that trend continues.
Excellent. Well, I'm really glad to know you and all the years that we've known each other since we met at EWF. It was the first ever Executive Women's Forum, right?
It actually was. And I looked at the event. I don't know that there were 25 of us, and the next year we went and there was a hurricane. So anyway, it's been a long time, and I've seen women advance in our industry. I still remember when you and I would go to conferences and there'd be like one or two women. Tell you that the lines to the women's bathroom are never ever busy. That's still the truth. And then I finally I did forget to mention that I'm doing a fair bit of mentoring these days.
Oh, good.
And I am, excited about the people that want to come and really, carry that torch forward. So everybody that's in those shoes, still fighting the good fight, keep it up.
How are you doing your mentoring? Because I like to think I'm sort of in a knowledge transfer stage myself, with all the 30 years of knowledge I have, sort of trying to share it back to the community. What do you consider your main venues for mentoring?
So currently I'm in an official program with 10 other CISOs, and the program's called the Evolving CISO. There's a class every month. And then I have 2 mentees. I don't know that that's the right word. They're cohorts of the program. Mm-hmm. And I have a male and a female. One of them is just so smart. He works for a crypto company. And the other is a lady who runs, security. She's second in command for another organization. And they're different. And so I find I'm learning much more from them on some levels than I'm actually giving to them. But those are the formats right now. And then the other is just I met some people at Black Hat recently that have reached out and been asking my advice and, wanting to know about this or that, or just some kind of challenge. And it's not technical, they're not calling me for technical advice. They're calling me because, they've got to go present to the board and, they're terrified or something like that. So it's great to be able to do this. And like I said, I think it really is a two-way street. So anybody that's thinking about mentoring or coaching, you really get back more than I think you give. So it's wonderful.
That's great advice, information. And if anybody wants some more links to resources, we will be providing them around the abstract of this podcast. And we'll also be providing your LinkedIn connection to the abstract of the podcast so people can find you, Renee. It's been really fun talking to you on a professional level. Just so everybody knows, I considered Renee a very close friend. Over the years, working with women in the industry is pretty important, and I'm really glad that I've had Renee on my side all these years. Thanks for joining us today, Renee.
And likewise, and thank you, Deb. Bye.
Tune in for our next podcast with Bob Martin, Senior Principal Engineer at the MITRE Corporation and Chair of the Steering Committee of the Industrial Internet Consortium. Until then, thanks to our audience for listening. And tune in again, and we will be talking with Bob Martin very soon.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the SciBeat Podcast with Deb Radcliff, part of the ITSPmagazine podcast network. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then share this channel and ITSPmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.